My lakefront property was everything I had worked 23 years to achieve. Every weekend, I would wake up to the sound of water lapping against the shore and spend my mornings working on my father's 1967 Chris Craft Cavalier. The boat was not just wood and fiberglass to me. It was the last connection I had to my dad, who passed away 3 years ago. The neighborhood felt like paradise back then. Kids would ride their bikes down our quiet streets while parents waved from perfectly manicured lawns. I knew everyone by name. The Johnsons next door would bring me fresh tomatoes from their garden. Mrs. Peterson across the street always had extra cookies for anyone who helped her with yard work. That was before Margaret Thornfield moved in. Margaret appeared at my door on a sunny Tuesday morning in April, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She was tall, maybe mid-50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Everything about her screamed control. "Hello there. I am Margaret Thornfield, your new HOA president," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I wanted to introduce myself and discuss some exciting new community standards we are implementing." I shook her hand, noticing how firm her grip was, almost like she was trying to prove something. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. I am Dave. What kind of standards are we talking about?" Her eyes immediately went to my boat, which was sitting on its trailer in my driveway. I had been working on refinishing the deck that morning, and my tools were spread out on a tarp. "Well, primarily we are focused on maintaining property values and ensuring our waterfront community looks its absolute best," she said, never taking her eyes off my boat. "That is a lovely vessel you have there. Vintage, I assume." 1967 Chris Craft. My father left it to me. I have been restoring it for the past 3 years. "How wonderful," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I hope you will not mind if I mention that our new regulations require all recreational vehicles, including boats, to be stored in enclosed structures or moved to approved off-site locations." My stomach dropped. "Excuse me, this boat has been in my driveway for 3 years. Nobody has ever complained." "Oh, I am sure nobody wanted to cause trouble," Margaret said with that same cold smile. "But now that we have proper leadership, we can address these issues appropriately. The regulation takes effect in 30 days. I am sure you understand." I felt my jaw clench. "Actually, I do not understand. This is my property. The boat does not hurt anyone." "Property values, Dave. We all have an investment to protect here. I am sure a reasonable person like yourself can see the bigger picture." After she left, I sat on my porch staring at my father's boat and feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. 30 days to figure out storage for a 20-foot boat, or face fines that could reach hundreds of dollars per day. That night, I called my neighbor Johnson to ask if he knew anything about these new regulations. "Dave, I got the same visit," he said quietly. "She told me my shed was too close to the property line and needs to be moved. Been there for 15 years without a problem." That was when I realized Margaret Thornfield was not interested in community improvement. She was interested in power, and my father's boat had just made me her primary target. The violations started the very next week. I would come home from work to find bright orange notices taped to my front door, each one more ridiculous than the last. Violation notice: boat trailer tire pressure appears insufficient for safe operation. Violation notice: boat cover secured with non-regulation bungee cords. Violation notice: boat positioning blocks sight line from street corner. Each violation came with a $50 fine and a demand for immediate correction. When I moved the boat 3 feet to address the sight line complaint, I received another violation for unauthorized repositioning of recreational vehicle without HOA approval. Margaret had turned my life into a bureaucratic nightmare. The worst part was watching my neighbors change. Mrs. Peterson stopped returning my waves. The Johnsons avoided eye contact when they saw me in the yard. I found out why when I overheard Margaret talking to a group of them at the community mailbox. I hate to say this, but Dave's boat situation is becoming a real problem, she was saying in that concerned voice she had perfected. Property values in waterfront communities are delicate things. One eyesore can affect everyone's investment. Plus, there are safety concerns with that trailer blocking emergency vehicle access. I wanted to march over there and set the record straight, but I knew it would only make me look like the difficult neighbor Margaret was painting me to be. Instead, I decided to research the HOA regulations myself. What I found made my blood boil. The boat storage requirement had been added to the community bylaws just 2 weeks before Margaret moved in. Not only that, but the vote to approve it had been conducted with only 5 homeowners present, despite our community having over 60 properties. I called for a meeting with the HOA board to challenge the regulation. "I appreciate your concerns, Dave," Margaret said from her seat at the head of the conference table in the community center. "But these regulations were voted on and approved through proper channels. The board stands behind its decision." 5 people voted on a rule that affects 60 families, I said. "How is that proper?" All residents were notified of the meeting. If people choose not to participate in community governance, that is their choice. Board member Carl Matthews, who owned the hardware store in town, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Margaret, maybe we could grandfather in existing boats." "The regulation is clear, Carl," Margaret cut him off. "No exceptions. That is how we maintain consistency and fairness." I looked around the table at the other board members. Every single one of them avoided eye contact. Margaret had them completely under her control. That night, I got a call from Tom Rodriguez, a man who used to live 3 streets over. "Dave, I heard about your boat situation. I want you to know you are not crazy, and you are not alone." "What do you mean?" "Margaret Thornfield destroyed my life for 18 months before I finally gave up and moved away. It started with my fence being 6 inches too tall, then my mailbox was the wrong color, then my garbage cans were visible from the street. Every week brought new violations, new fines, new threats." My heart pounded. "Why did not you fight back?" "I tried, but she has a system, Dave. She isolates you, turns the neighbors against you, makes everything technically legal. By the time I realized what was happening, I owed the HOA over $8,000 in fines and was facing a lien on my house. There has to be something we can do." "Maybe, but be careful. Margaret Thornfield does not just want to win. She wants to completely destroy anyone who challenges her authority." After I hung up, I sat in my living room staring out at my father's boat and feeling more alone than I had since his funeral. Margaret was not just targeting my boat. She was systematically dismantling my entire life, one violation at a time. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, I was going to learn her game, and I was going to play it better than she ever could. I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought maybe someone was having an early morning campfire by the lake. But as the acrid smell grew stronger, a terrible fear crept into my chest. I threw on clothes and ran outside, already knowing what I would find. My father's boat was engulfed in flames. The fire department was already there, along with 2 police cars and Margaret Thornfield, who stood at the edge of my driveway with her ever-present clipboard. The flames had consumed the entire deck and were working their way through the hull. 20 years of my father's craftsmanship, 3 years of my restoration work, and a lifetime of memories were turning to ash before my eyes. I stood there in my bare feet and pajamas, watching the last physical connection to my father disappear in clouds of black smoke. "Sir, you need to step back," one of the firefighters said, putting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We have it contained, but the heat is still dangerous." "What happened?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Fire Chief Williams walked over with a grim expression. "We received a call around 5:30 this morning reporting an abandoned boat fire. When we arrived, the vessel was fully involved." "Abandoned? This boat is not abandoned. I work on it every weekend." Chief Williams glanced over at Margaret, who was now talking to a police officer and gesturing toward the burning wreckage. According to the caller, the boat had been declared a safety hazard by the Homeowners Association and was scheduled for emergency removal today. My vision blurred with rage. "That is not true. Nobody told me about any emergency removal." "I am sorry, sir. You will need to discuss this with the HOA representative and the investigating officer." I walked over to where Margaret was speaking with Officer Peterson, forcing myself to stay calm even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. "Margaret, what the hell is going on?" She turned to me with that same cold smile, completely unfazed by the destruction behind her. "Good morning, Dave. I am so sorry about this unfortunate situation. After our last conversation, the board determined that your boat posed an immediate fire hazard and authorized emergency removal. Unfortunately, it appears the boat ignited during the preparation process." "You burned my father's boat." "Of course not," she said, pulling out a folder from her portfolio. "We hired licensed contractors to remove the vessel safely. However, apparently some fuel or oil leaked during the process and created a fire hazard. These old boats can be quite dangerous when they are not properly maintained." Officer Peterson looked at the paperwork Margaret handed him. "Mrs. Thornfield has all the proper authorization here, Mr. Johnson. Emergency removal order signed by the HOA board, licensed disposal company contacted, all procedures followed correctly." I felt like I was drowning. "Officer, this woman just destroyed my property based on fake emergency orders. How is this legal?" "The Homeowners Association has the authority to remove safety hazards from member properties," he said. "If you want to dispute their determination, you will need to take it up with them or consult an attorney." As the officer walked away, Margaret stepped closer to me. For the first time, her mask slipped completely. The smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You should have moved the boat when I asked nicely, Dave," she said quietly. "This could have been avoided if you had just followed the rules like everyone else." "You are insane." "I am effective. And now you owe the association $4,000 in emergency removal fees, plus the standard fines for noncompliance. Payment is due within 30 days, or we will place a lien on your property." She handed me an invoice and walked away, leaving me standing in the ashes of everything I had left of my father. That afternoon, I called every attorney in 3 counties. The message was always the same. HOA disputes were complex, expensive, and rarely successful. Margaret had covered her tracks perfectly. Every document was in order, every procedure had been followed, every witness supported her version of events. The legal system had failed me. The community had abandoned me. And Margaret Thornfield had taken the last thing on earth that connected me to my father. But as I stood there in the charred remains of my driveway, picking up pieces of burned wood that had once been my father's pride and joy, something inside me crystallized into pure, focused rage. Margaret thought she had won. She thought burning my boat would break me and force me to fall in line like all her other victims. She had made the biggest mistake of her life. If Margaret Thornfield wanted to play with fire, I was about to show her what getting burned really felt like. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something Margaret never expected. Instead of fighting her directly, I became a student of her methods. I researched everything about Margaret Thornfield, and what I discovered made my skin crawl. Margaret was not just a controlling neighbor. She was a professional destroyer of communities. Her pattern was always the same. She would move into a neighborhood, run for HOA president, then systematically harass homeowners until they either fell in line or moved away. Over the past 12 years, she had lived in 3 different communities across 2 states, leaving a trail of broken families and destroyed lives in her wake. The financial records were even more disturbing. In her previous neighborhood, the HOA had mysteriously spent $18,000 on legal consultations with a law firm owned by Margaret's brother. Another $15,000 had gone to landscaping improvements, contracted through a company that listed Margaret's home address as its business location. Margaret Thornfield was not just a power-hungry neighbor. She was a criminal who had turned community harassment into a profitable business. I started reaching out to her previous victims. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating. Sarah Chin from Margaret's first neighborhood had been fined into bankruptcy over the color of her shutters. She claimed they were colonial blue instead of heritage blue, Sarah told me over the phone. The fines started at $50 a week and escalated to $500 a day. I lost my house. Mark Williams from the second community had been driven out over his dog. Margaret claimed my golden retriever was a dangerous breed and needed to be removed. When I refused, she hired people to file noise complaints every single day. The city finally forced me to choose between my dog and my home. But the most disturbing call came from Janet Morrison, who had lived in Margaret's third neighborhood. She did not just target individual homeowners, Janet said. She would identify the community leaders, the people everyone respected, and destroy them first. Once she eliminated the opposition, everyone else fell in line out of fear. How did she destroy them? False accusations, planted evidence. She once got a school principal fired by claiming he was embezzling from the HOA. Turned out later that Margaret had been moving money around and blaming him for the missing funds. My blood went cold. Did anyone ever prove it? By the time we figured out what she was doing, she had already moved on to her next victim. Margaret never stays long enough to face consequences. She burns down communities and disappears. That night, I sat by the lake where my father's boat had once been launched every summer morning. The water was calm, reflecting the moon like a black mirror. This lake had been my sanctuary, my place of peace. Now it felt like a battlefield. I pulled out my phone and called Tom Rodriguez, the former neighbor who had first warned me about Margaret. "Tom, I need to ask you something. When Margaret was harassing you, did you ever notice money disappearing from the HOA accounts?" There was a long pause. "Actually, yes. The association was supposed to have enough money to repave our streets, but Margaret kept saying the funds were not available. Why?" "Because I think Margaret Thornfield has been stealing from our community for months, and I think I can prove it." Over the next week, I submitted formal requests for all HOA financial records. Margaret tried to delay and deflect, but state law required disclosure of association finances to homeowners. When the documents finally arrived, the pattern was unmistakable. Landscaping contracts to non-existent companies, legal fees for Margaret's personal property disputes charged to the HOA account, even vacation expenses disguised as community research trips to study other neighborhoods. Margaret had stolen over $35,000 from our community. But money was not enough. Margaret had taken something from me that could never be replaced. She had burned my father's memory to ash and scattered my life to the wind. Financial crimes would put her in jail. What I had in mind would do something much worse. I was going to give Margaret Thornfield exactly what she had given to dozens of families over the years. I was going to take away everything she thought made her powerful, strip away every illusion of control she had built, and leave her as broken and helpless as every victim she had ever destroyed. The lake where my father's boat had been burned would be the perfect place for Margaret's empire to sink forever. Margaret's fatal mistake came 3 weeks later when she overplayed her hand. She filed a formal complaint with the county claiming I was harassing her by requesting HOA financial records. The complaint accused me of stalking behavior and demanded a restraining order. But Margaret's complaint backfired spectacularly. When county investigators looked into her claims, they noticed the same financial irregularities I had discovered. What was supposed to destroy me instead triggered a formal audit of our HOA accounts. I called for an emergency community meeting to present my findings to the entire neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and by the night of the meeting, our community center was packed with over 40 homeowners. People who had not spoken to each other in months came together, united by years of Margaret's abuse. Margaret arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, flanked by her remaining supporters. Carl Matthews from the hardware store looked uncomfortable. Board member Susan Walsh kept checking her phone like she wanted to be anywhere else. Only Margaret seemed confident as she took her place at the front of the room. "Before we begin tonight's meeting," Margaret announced, "I want to address some unfortunate rumors that have been circulating about our association's finances. I assure everyone that our books are completely transparent and properly managed." "Then you will not mind if we review them together," I said, standing up with a folder full of financial documents. Margaret's smile flickered. "Dave, I think we have heard enough from you lately. Your recent behavior has been quite concerning to many residents." My behavior? I looked around the room at faces I had known for years. "Margaret, how much did the HOA pay your brother's law firm last year?" "That is confidential, legal expense information." $18,000, I announced to the room, for legal advice about boat regulations that somehow required 6 months of consultation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward in her chair. "How much did we pay for the landscaping work at the community entrance?" I continued. "Those improvements were necessary for property values," Margaret said, but her voice had lost its usual authority. $12,000 to a company that does not exist. The address listed for Premium Landscaping Solutions is Margaret's home address. The murmurs turned into angry voices. Tom Rodriguez stood up. "Margaret, you told us the association could not afford to fix the playground equipment because we did not have enough money in our accounts." "Budget priorities require careful consideration," Margaret replied, but sweat was beginning to show on her forehead. "What about the $4,000 in conference expenses for Margaret to attend community management seminars in Florida?" I asked. 3 different trips, all to resort locations, all charged to our HOA account. Board member Carl Matthews stood up. Margaret, is this true? Those were legitimate educational expenses, she snapped. Community management requires staying current with best practices. Best practices like burning down residents' property. The voice came from the back of the room. A woman I did not recognize stepped forward. My name is Janet Morrison. I lived in Willowbrook Estates before Margaret moved here. She destroyed my community the same way she is destroying yours. Margaret's face went white. You have no business being here. I have every right to warn these people about what you are, Janet said. Margaret Thornfield is a professional con artist who targets homeowner associations. She embezzles money, harasses residents, and destroys communities for profit. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been silent for months started sharing their own stories of harassment and abuse. The Johnsons talked about threats to remove their garden shed. Mrs. Peterson admitted she had been fined for having the wrong style of mailbox. Family after family stood up to testify about Margaret's reign of terror. Margaret tried desperately to maintain control. This is clearly a coordinated attack by disgruntled residents who refuse to follow community standards, she shouted over the noise. I will not sit here and listen to these false accusations. Then maybe you should explain where the money went, I said, pulling out bank statements. $35,000 in questionable expenses over 18 months. Money that was supposed to go to street repairs, playground maintenance, and community improvements. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. You have no idea what you are dealing with, she screamed. I have destroyed people like you before, and I will do it again. You think your little meeting changes anything. I still control this board, I still control these rules, and I will make your life hell until you crawl away like all the others. The room fell silent. Margaret had finally shown everyone exactly who she really was. Carl Matthews stood up slowly. Margaret, I move for your immediate resignation as HOA president. Seconded, said Susan Walsh. All in favor? Carl asked. Every hand in the room went up. Margaret looked around at the sea of raised hands, her empire of fear crumbling in real time. This is not over, she said quietly. Not even close. As she gathered her papers and walked toward the exit, she stopped next to my chair. You have no idea what you have just started, she whispered. But you are about to find out. The threat sent chills down my spine. Margaret Thornfield had just lost everything she thought made her powerful, which made her more dangerous than ever. Margaret's revenge came exactly 1 week later, and it was more elaborate than anything she had tried before. I was working in my garage when Officer Peterson pulled into my driveway with 2 other patrol cars behind him. My heart sank as I watched 6 police officers get out and walk toward me with serious expressions. David Johnson, you are under arrest for criminal harassment, trespassing, and destruction of property, Officer Peterson said, pulling out handcuffs. What property? Margaret Thornfield's windows were broken last night. Security cameras show someone matching your description throwing rocks at her house at 2 in the morning. My mind raced. That is impossible. I was home asleep. Check my phone records, my internet activity, anything. We also found evidence that you have been stalking Mrs. Thornfield and making threatening phone calls. Officer Peterson showed me photos on his tablet. Security camera footage of someone in dark clothing throwing objects at Margaret's house. Phone records showing calls from my number to Margaret's at all hours of the night. Even receipts for spray paint found in my garage trash can, allegedly used to vandalize her car. The evidence was overwhelming and completely fabricated. This is a setup, I said as the handcuffs clicked around my wrists. "Margaret planted all of this." "You can explain that to the judge," Officer Peterson said. "But I never made it to jail." As we drove past the lake where my father's boat had been burned, I saw Margaret standing at the water's edge with her phone, clearly documenting my arrest for social media. The sight of her smug satisfaction filled me with a rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. "Stop the car," I said. "What?" I said stop the car. "I need to talk to Margaret Thornfield right now." Officer Peterson pulled over, probably thinking I wanted to confess or apologize. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. "Margaret," I called out as I walked toward her with the officers following behind. "You want to document this moment. Let me give you something worth recording." She raised her phone, ready to capture my humiliation on video. "You burned my father's boat because you thought it would break me," I said, my voice carrying across the water. "You framed me for crimes I did not commit because you thought it would silence me. You have been stealing from this community for over a year because you thought nobody would catch you." "Dave, you need to calm down," Officer Peterson said. "But here is what you did not think about, Margaret. Every lie you just told, every piece of evidence you planted, every detail of your frame job. I recorded all of it." Margaret's smug expression faltered. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my phone, which had been recording audio since the moment the police arrived. Voice-activated recording app. "Been running for 20 minutes. Every word the officers said about your evidence, every detail about the supposed security footage, all of it saved to cloud storage." "You are bluffing." Margaret Thornfield, 1247 Lakeshore Drive, previously lived at 892 Elm Street in Millbrook and 456 Pine Avenue in Riverside. Professional con artist who targets homeowner associations. Embezzled $35,000 from our community account. And now, you have just committed multiple felonies by filing false police reports and planting evidence. Margaret's face went dead white. The officers looked confused, unsure what to believe. "She has been planning this for days," I continued. "Check the timestamps on that security footage. Check when she bought the spray paint she planted in my trash. Check her phone records to see when she made those calls to herself from a spoofed number." Officer Peterson was already on his radio, calling for backup and requesting a detective. Margaret realized her perfect plan was unraveling in real time. "You think you are so smart," she snarled, all pretense of civility finally gone. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will destroy you and everyone you care about." That was when Margaret made her final, fatal mistake. She lunged at me, trying to grab my phone to delete the recording. The struggle was brief but intense. Margaret was stronger than she looked, and desperation gave her extra strength. We grappled for control of the phone, stumbling closer and closer to the water's edge. "Give me that phone," she screamed. "The truth is already backed up online," I said. "You cannot delete what everyone already knows." Margaret's response was to try to push me into the lake, probably hoping I would drop the phone in the water. But as she shoved me backward, her foot slipped on the muddy bank. We both went into the lake with a tremendous splash. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than expected. Margaret immediately started panicking, thrashing wildly as she tried to swim to shore. But her heavy clothes and panic made it impossible for her to stay afloat. I watched her go under once, twice, 3 times. The officers were shouting from the shore, but none of them were jumping in to help. In that moment, I had a choice. I could let Margaret Thornfield drown and claim it was an accident, Nobody would question it after everything she had done. Instead, I swam over and pulled her to safety. As we climbed out of the lake, both of us soaking wet and covered in mud, Margaret broke down completely. The cold, calculated predator was gone, replaced by a sobbing, broken woman who had finally been caught. "I am sorry," she gasped between tears. "I am so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted people to respect me. I wanted to matter." The entire community had gathered to watch Margaret's final humiliation. Neighbors she had terrorized for months stood in silent judgment as she confessed to years of theft, harassment, and abuse. "I planted the evidence," she admitted to the officers. "I made the false reports. I stole the money, all of it. Everything he said is true." Margaret Thornfield's empire of fear had finally sunk to the bottom of the lake, and she had gone down with it. 6 months later, I stood on the shore of the same lake watching a brand new Chris Craft Cavalier slide into the water for its maiden voyage. The insurance settlement from my father's destroyed boat had been enough to commission an exact replica, built by craftsmen who understood that some things are worth more than money. Margaret Thornfield was serving 18 months in county jail for embezzlement, filing false police reports, and harassment. The judge had been particularly harsh after hearing testimony from victims across 3 different communities. Her criminal record would follow her forever, making it impossible for her to ever again hold power over homeowner associations. The stolen money had been recovered and used to make real improvements to our community. New playground equipment for the children, proper street repairs that Margaret had claimed we could not afford, even a small memorial garden by the lake where residents could sit and enjoy the peace that had been missing for so long. Our new community organization was built on principles Margaret would have hated: transparency instead of secrecy, cooperation instead of control, respect instead of fear. I had been elected president, but only after establishing term limits and checks on authority that would prevent any future Margaret from taking over. The healing process had not been easy. Some neighbors still felt guilty about their silence during Margaret's reign of terror. Others struggled with trusting any form of community leadership after being manipulated for so long. But slowly, gradually, our neighborhood began to remember what it felt like to be a real community. Mrs. Peterson started bringing cookies around again, this time with genuine smiles instead of fearful politeness. The Johnsons invited me over for barbecues where we talked about normal things like sports and weather instead of HOA violations. Kids rode their bikes through streets that no longer felt like a police state. The lake itself seemed different now, cleaner somehow, like Margaret's defeat had washed away years of accumulated negativity. Families came to swim and picnic. Couples walked hand in hand along the shore. The water reflected sunlight instead of just darkness. As I prepared to launch my father's boat for the first time, I thought about the choice I had made in the water that day. I could have let Margaret drown and justified it as justice for all the lives she had destroyed. But saving her had been the right decision, not because she deserved mercy, but because I deserved to be better than the monster she had become. My father had taught me that a man's character is measured not by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats his enemies. In that moment underwater, I had chosen to be the son he raised me to be. The new boat handled beautifully, cutting through the water with the same grace my father had loved decades earlier. But this vessel carried more than just memories of the past. It represented hope for the future, proof that even the most devastating losses can lead to new beginnings. As I anchored in the middle of the lake, I could see the entire community spread out along the shore, children playing in yards that were finally safe, Adults talking with neighbors they could actually trust. Gardens growing without fear of violation notices. Normal life, returning like spring after a brutal winter. Margaret Thornfield had tried to build an empire based on fear and control. In the end, she had only succeeded in teaching us the value of the opposite. Community built on mutual respect. Leadership based on service rather than power. Justice tempered with mercy. The sun was setting over the water, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. I started the engine and headed back to shore, where my neighbors were gathering for our monthly community barbecue. Not a mandatory HOA meeting with violations and fines, but a simple gathering of people who had chosen to build something better together. As I tied up the boat at my dock, I could hear laughter and conversation drifting down from the community center. Real laughter, not the nervous kind we had all become used to during Margaret's reign. My father's boat was gone forever, burned to ash by a woman who thought destruction was strength. But his memory lived on in this new vessel, in this restored community, and in the lesson that sometimes you have to fight for the things that matter most. Margaret Thornfield had declared war on our community and thought she would win through fear and intimidation. Instead, she had accidentally taught us something far more valuable. She had shown us exactly who we did not want to be.